he was the right man for the job at the time.
Looking back afterwards, we realised that if it hadn't been for him, I think we'd have finished in 1940.
Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born at Blenheim Palace, Oxfordshire in 1874. Schooled at Harrow, he went on to Sandhurst and before entering Parliament was a professional soldier. In 1934, the German president Hindenburg died. Adolf Hitler could now move towards his ultimate goal, absolute power. The once lowly ex-corporal and failed artist became all-powerful. He could now set about moulding Germany towards a destiny which he believed was due. I dread the day when the means of threatening the heart of the British Empire should pass into the hands of the present rulers of Germany. If I read the future right, Hitler's government will confront Europe with a series of outrageous events and ever-growing military might. The government cannot make up their minds, or they cannot get the Prime Minister to make up his mind, so they go on in a strange paradox decided only to be undecided. Resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, all-powerful to be impotent. On September the 3rd, 1939, the talking stopped. The war everybody knew was inevitable came to pass. That Sunday, Churchill told Parliament, "Outside the storms of war may blow, and the lands may be lashed with the fury of its gales, but in our own hearts, this Sunday morning, there is peace. Our hands may be active, but our consciences are at rest." The country needed Churchill. After 23 years, he returned to the Admiralty to watch Poland being destroyed. Hitler remained ominously quiescent. What was called the phony war supervened. British troops were sent to France. Defense rather than attack was the essence of Allied thinking. That winter, there was one dismal attempt to seize the initiative. Dreadfully organized, the Narvik expedition ended in defeat and humiliation. The country was beginning to despair with Chamberlain. He was proving to be as ineffectual in war as in peace. The pressure for his resignation was intense. The country needed leadership in these dark days. On the afternoon of May the 10th, 1940, Churchill received the seals of highest office. "I felt that I was walking with destiny and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." Coincidentally, it was the same day Germany moved into the Low Countries. The phony war was over. Hitler had now turned westward. He was determined, ultimately, on a devastating offensive which would ensure Nazi domination of the whole of Europe. France was not caught napping. It was fully aware of Hitler's objective and had built up an army widely considered to be the best in Europe. And with 10 divisions of the British Expeditionary Force, they were ready. But they weren't ready for blitzkrieg. Belgium was quickly overrun. 4 days later, the Dutch negotiated a surrender. That same day, Churchill received horrifying news from France. A huge German concentration of armour had passed the Ardennes, previously thought impassable. Ripping open a 50-mile breach in the centre of French defences, German panzers were now racing towards the northern French coast. the British expeditionary forces were in rapid retreat. There was no doubt the German generals were in total control. A minor British counterattack at Arras proved fruitless. The rout accelerated. The British commander Lord Gort fell back to the Channel coast. As the Germans, taken aback by their own success, paused to consolidate, the miracle of Dunkirk began. From the Kent coast, a measure of boats of every size and shape streamed out across the Channel. By early June, they had managed to evacuate 340,000 Allied troops, nearly 300,000 more than Churchill felt possible. It was events such as Dunkirk that gave Churchill the public image of a leader. Privately, he demanded and received tremendous loyalty.
The master was one who inspired loyalty amongst his group. During the years when I was on his staff, there was a need for the utmost responsibility on the part of all concerned. Documents of the highest secrecy had naturally to be dealt with. Careless talk could have been costly to the war. The group surrounding Mr. Churchill were devoted, and their loyalty was indisputable, and they worked with all they had to offer.
On the 24th of June, the French government made a sham of a peace. Britain was alone, the last European country that was standing up to Nazism. Britain became a haven for the dispossessed from Europe and beyond. To all in London, the warm summer of 1940 was one of fear and uncertainty. Dunkirk was hardly a victory. Britain's nearest ally was the United States, an ocean away, and still a reluctant and cool friend. Over the next 9 months, the Germans had a series of brilliant victories. Hitler was ruler of Europe, absolute ruler of a dozen nations. His allies were formidable. Stalin's huge Soviet Union, fiercely militaristic Japan, fascist Italy with her modern navy. For Churchill and the nation, the outlook was bleak. With the extraordinary success everywhere of the German army, the Wehrmacht had acquired a weapon yet more potent than their all-conquering panzers. For the conviction was spreading that the Germans were indeed invincible. There was a growing school of thought in the corridors of Whitehall that we should do a deal, accept any conditions, embrace any humiliation, merely to be allowed to survive. Hitler seemed unassailable, and to the stunned people of continental Europe, the thousand-year Reich appeared a grim reality. Churchill needed to be strong. It was at this moment that Hitler was confronted for the first time by an adversary unshakable and determined. Above the tumult of wars and armies, there rang out over Europe a voice marvelous in defiance, ardent in the courage never to submit or yield, a voice full of resolution and faith in victory. Churchill was a masterful orator that could thrill and inspire a nation.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
All over Europe, Allied prisoners, often with no other language in common, would exchange in greeting a single whispered word: Churchill. Churchill. For them, he was the hope, the savior.
I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might, and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be.
He would lead Britain to a dramatic victory. The price, though, would be immense. Following the Compiègne armistice, the French Atlantic ports became naval bases for the Germans, who also acquired new and more westerly airfields. Their U-boats and aircraft were thereby enhanced and were formidable. Churchill's new coalition war cabinet feared such a strong fleet, still intact and, in theory, controlled by the puppet French Vichy government. The ships were mainly in Mediterranean ports. Were they to fall into German hands, the German navy would be virtually invincible. Although recent comrades in arms, Admiral Darlan refused to commit his ships to Britain. Churchill could not wait. He immediately ordered the Royal Navy to destroy the main French squadron at Mer-Alquibert. It was a hateful decision, the most unnatural and painful with which I have ever been associated. 50 miles outside London was a large, rambling, stately home called Bletchley Park. It was home to a remarkable assembly of the British mathematical and scientific minds. They were proved to be the backbone of Churchill's strategy. They provided him with accurate and immediate intelligence. The German military had refined a highly sophisticated encryption machine, Enigma, whose revolving drums could generate literally trillions of combinations. The Germans had good grounds for believing that Enigma was impossible to break. Bletchley achieved the impossible. Enigma machines were successfully replicated. Then, with the help of the Bronze Oracle, one of the very earliest computers, the military codes were broken one by one. The information yielded was given the unique classification Ultra. Not long elapsed before what Churchill called his most secret source showed its value. From June 1940 onwards, intelligence was showing that Hitler was preparing for the invasion of Britain itself. On August the 1st, a Goering signal was intercepted. The Luftwaffe was ready to eliminate the Royal Air Force as rapidly as possible. By the 14th of August, the Battle of Britain had begun. On paper, it was hopeless. Against the Luftwaffe's 2,800 fighters and bombers were pitted only 650 Spitfires and Hurricanes. But besides Ultra, Air Marshal Dowding had yet another advantage: radar systems. Dowding knew that if the Luftwaffe gained absolute air superiority, no navy in the world could stop the invasion barges crossing the Channel. He conserved his resources with the utmost economy whilst continuing to meet every raid. After a month, Goering, not knowing how near he had come to crippling fighter command, changed targets. The battered aerodromes and radar stations were granted a merciful respite. Hitler intended to demoralize Britain. It became the turn of the cities. England was being blitzed.
The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age. Let us, therefore, brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
The Luftwaffe was designed for army support and not strategic bombing. Although tens of thousands lost their lives and millions of homes wrecked, damage was much less than forecast. Morale, production, and communications went largely unaffected. From mid-September, Churchill knew, although he could not reveal, that the invasion was off. His gratitude was unstinted.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Whilst London burned, the tides were turning on the other side of the Atlantic. The hard-lined isolationists could still be heard, but although both presidential candidates were pledged to keeping the boys back home, US public opinion was beginning to accept that Hitler must be stopped. Meanwhile, another unrelenting, no less critical contest was being played out far away on the broad Atlantic. In 1940, the U-boat fleet, while still small, was achieving frightening success against the merchant navy. There were too few escorts, and the Irish Republic's neutrality meant that they would not allow British warships into their ports. Churchill needed to keep the country's morale up and needed a flow of good news. He could be economical with the truth and often exaggerated the number of enemy submarines claimed sunk. He was also anxiously aware of just how dangerous was the hemorrhage in the vital Atlantic supply lines. Admiral Dönitz was perfecting the open ocean Wolfpack system. Fortunately, bad winter weather brought some temporary relief. By October, when in another staff change Churchill replaced the commander of the Home Fleet, 2 million tons of shipping had been lost. Churchill desperately needed the support of the US, which was still a reluctant ally. That autumn, a significant first step was taken when Roosevelt agreed to trade 50 old and near-useless destroyers for a ring of valuable British bases. The bargain in itself was so poor that Churchill tried to keep the details quiet. But as a token of American commitment, he said, "The destroyers are worth their weight in rubies."
On a cold, drizzly morning in the spring of 1944, I was the night duty officer. That evening, Mr. Churchill was due to have dinner at the British Embassy. At 4:30 a.m., assuming that he must have returned and gone to bed, I pulled out a cot, stripped to my shorts and turned in. A few minutes later came a knock on the door and the voice of the usher, "Sir, the Prime Minister." I sprang from my cot, opened the door and came to attention as best I could under the circumstances. Mr. Churchill, immaculate in white tie and tails, eyed my uniform and said in a gentle way, "Good morning, Captain. Perhaps it would be well for both of us to retire."
Meetings with Roosevelt continued to be warm and frequent. Nevertheless, Churchill may have sometimes misunderstood where the enigmatic president's intentions lay. The greater good of the US was, or had to be, his first consideration. America would gladly become the arsenal of democracy, but the enterprise would be run on strictly commercial principles. As 1940 drew to a close, Churchill dared not make public his most burdensome anxiety. Britain was almost bankrupt. Churchill managed to get a bill passed allowing Britain to borrow finance from the US. He gave a moving appeal.
Put your confidence in us. Give us your faith and your blessing, and under Providence, all will be well. We shall not fail or falter, we shall not weaken nor tire. Neither the sudden shock of battle nor the long-drawn trials of vigilance and exertion will wear us down. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job.
But before Lend-Lease, there came cash and carry. The US wanted first all of Britain's own gold reserves, then any gold that could be got from allies. All overseas assets, private or public, had to be sold off, often at knockdown prices. Large profits were made on Wall Street. The British-owned Viscous Company, after liquidation, realized $87 million. It had been worth around 40 millions more. The Americans also wanted into Britain's export markets. Imperial preference was abolished. This was not all. In the wider interests of furthering the war effort, Churchill sent over a high-level mission empowered to pass on to the delighted Americans the finest fruits of British scientific and industrial research. They handed over details of the newest discoveries and inventions in anti-aircraft technology, explosives, rocketry, electronics, and the jet engine. There was a prototype of the cavity magnetron, which by vastly increasing the power of radar, allowed it to be carried in aircraft for the first time. All these were goodwill gifts. With invasion still a real possibility, Churchill had taken the dramatic step of sending 150 tanks to Egypt. Military involvement in the Mediterranean was increasing steadily, partly because there was no other opportunity for fighting the Axis powers on land. Gradually, too, Churchill became aware there was a route north through what he called the soft underbelly of Europe. In September 1940, Mussolini was advancing on two fronts. He had one large army in Abyssinia and another advancing hesitantly into Egypt. He then embarked on what was to be the catastrophic invasion of Greece. The Italian navy, albeit of uncertain prowess, possessed some of the most modern warships afloat, but it was at sea he sustained his first rebuff. In one sea battle at Taranto, he lost half of the entire fleet in an imaginatively daring attack launched from Admiral Cunningham's only carrier. Churchill had no time for the cold and abrupt Wavell, whom he considered unfairly to be lacking in fighting spirit. Yet it was Wavell's finest commander, General O'Connor, who got the victories for which Churchill prayed. A brilliant 2 months campaign took O'Connor from Egypt to Tobruk and on to El Algier. By February 1941, his two divisions had captured 130,000 prisoners for less than 500 dead. His rear secure, Wavell was quickly able to finish off the stranded Italian Abyssinian army. O'Connor was poised to clear the Nazis out of North Africa entirely, but the chance was lost. Churchill learned through Ultra that Hitler was coming to the aid of the Italians, whose Greek offensive was floundering. Not for the first time, emotion replaced sound instincts. Greece, civilization's birthplace, had a British guarantee. Thus, O'Connor's experienced troops were diverted into a no-win campaign in which landings and evacuations were going on simultaneously. It was a Dunkirk without the glory. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe had built up a strong base on the island of Sicily. Fresh German detachments began arriving in Tripoli. They had a new commander, Erwin Rommel. O'Connor's gains melted away. Rommel seemed to be invincible after the siege of Tobruk. Even worse was the shambles at Crete, garrisoned by 40,000 Allied troops. Although British command of the sea was assured, air cover was very poor. The island fell to a purely airborne assault. Churchill seemed to be philosophical about the loss.
I remember one day in 1941 when things were going really badly. We had to evacuate Greece. Crete was falling. I was alone at Chartwell with Churchill in the cottage he'd built with his own hands. We were at lunch, and Churchill was in a very sombre mood. He got hold of the marmalade cat and put it on the chair on his right-hand side, and put me on the left-hand side. The cat had precedence. He was saying, "Dear cat, it is so sad that in wartime I can't give you any cream of that sort." He didn't address a word to me throughout the lunch. The cat was the only object of his conversation.
The disaster was less than it first appeared. German losses of aircraft and elite paratroops had been heavy, and they were unable to repeat the assault anywhere in the region. Even so, Churchill badly needed some good news. Crete was devastating to morale. In the spring of 1941, there was all too much cause for gloom. The Luftwaffe was being transferred east, but not before two huge farewell raids on London in April. During the same month, U-boats sank a record number of Allied ships. Churchill had insisted on action against Rommel, but Wavell's resources had been hopelessly depleted, and when Operation Battle Axe finally got underway, it soon was under pressure. However unfairly, the scent of failure clung to Wavell, whom Churchill now replaced with Auchinleck. On the morning of June the 22nd, the world awoke to momentous news. Hitler had attacked his erstwhile ally, the Soviet Union, throwing 3 million men over hundreds of miles of frontier. Churchill had warned Stalin, but he chose to ignore ultra-intelligence.
He had been reading the ultra signals. He said that there is no doubt about it, that that man is going to invade the Soviet Union. So I, for want of anything better to say, said, "Won't that be difficult for you? Because after all, you were the person who tried to raise an army against the Bolsheviks in 1919. My dear boy," he said, "if Hitler was to invade hell, I would make a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons."
The Red Army had suffered badly. Ill-prepared and under-equipped, and with poor leadership, the Soviet defences suffered a searing onslaught. Stalin cabled Churchill, "The Soviet Union is in mortal peril." The German divisions were awesome, pushing more than 50 miles in one day. In huge encirclements, they took hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners. Stalin struggled to take control of the crisis. For 9 days, Russia drifted rudderless. Then, finding his resolve, Stalin began an offensive. Chaos gradually gave way to order. At this point, Churchill still didn't know if he had gained an ally. His concern was the obvious backlash from the US. He needed them, but did they want to sit at the same table with communists, the arch-enemy of Western democracy? In August, he met Roosevelt at Placentia Bay for a cordial but unproductive meeting. The Americans were now thinking Churchill had a hidden agenda.
The most remarkable ambitions were ascribed to us in Washington, that we wanted to take over Greece and things like that. Towards the end of the war, what upset Churchill was the growing conviction in Washington that the most powerful and trustworthy American ally of the future was the Soviet Union.
By December, Soviet casualties were running in the millions, and forward German units were in sight of the golden domes of the Kremlin. But already there were inauspicious omens. Hitler decided to shift strategy. This blunted the main thrust of his offensive. Communications with Berlin were poor. Hitler was dismayed to find the new Soviet armor stronger than he expected, and the German army were completely unprepared for the savage Russian winter. Stalin, meantime, had exerted his considerable talents to the full. Entire factories had been moved east, but however sombre a cost to his own people, he was rapidly transforming the Soviet Union into a military superpower. Organizing the counterattack in front of Moscow was probably the war's greatest commander, Georgy Zhukov. The Blitzkrieg was over. In the smaller North African theatre of war, Auchinleck finally moved against the supply-starved Rommel in November, relieved Tobruk, and once more advanced into Libya. But yet again, a promising offensive was halted because troops were pulled out. Two of the divisions were urgently recalled for the defence of their native land, Australia. On December the 7th, Admiral Yamamoto, with one single act, became Churchill's greatest ally. He attacked Pearl Harbor. Thus, in spectacular fashion, Churchill's most cherished hope was fulfilled. Now, the world's richest nation was a committed ally. Cleverly, Churchill's declarations of war on Japan preceded even that of Roosevelt. Yet Churchill could not relax immediately. The US was primarily a naval power, and there was the real possibility that she would concentrate on a war in the Pacific against the Japanese and have no interest in the war in Europe, thus leaving Britain and the mistrusted Soviets still to deal with the Nazi onslaught. Churchill got an early Christmas present. On December the 11th, both Hitler and Mussolini declared war on the US. Churchill's relief was profound. The defeat of Nazi Germany was the overriding priority. The foundations of a close and unusually effective military alliance were laid. During the trip, the 67-year-old Premier had a mild heart attack. His physician dared not tell him, and somehow Churchill's remarkable constitution saw him through. For 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese zone of conquest spread ever wider. However, there was more grim news for Churchill looming. Undervaluing the need for air cover, he sent the Prince of Wales and the Repulse to Malaysia, unaccompanied by a carrier. Both were sunk. In February, Singapore was forced into a humiliating capitulation. 180,000 defenders were led off into a cruel and hideous captivity. 100 years of imperial domination crumbled overnight. By March, Rangoon and nearly all of Burma had fallen to the Japanese, and Rommel was still triumphing in North Africa. In June, Auchinleck fell back to a defensive position at Al Alamein, where he held firm. Nevertheless, in nearby Alexandria, panic reigned. Churchill was deeply depressed. In April, 700,000 tons of merchant shipping had been lost. There was also the need to reduce rations, which caused a huge morale problem. The Arctic convoy PQ-17, which Churchill had insisted sailed, despite the dangerously light nights, had scattered after an alarm and 2/3 of the ships were lost. On top of this, the German Eastern Front offensive seemed to have regained its impetus. A formal no-confidence motion was put down in Parliament. It was one of Churchill's darkest hours. He needed some striking military success. The mighty conflict was now at its zenith, with both Germany and Japan at the apex of their conquests, yet neither empire could be sustained. Slowly but steadily, fortune's tide was turning. And although he constantly hoped and dreamed otherwise, Hitler knew that he had played and lost. With alarming speed, he began to implement the last and most vile of all his schemes. Hitler's wars had never been wars of conquest and plunder. As Churchill had long proclaimed, they were wars of enslavement. Europe's Jews and Romanies were the first to feel his regime of ethnic cleansing. It was soon apparent that machine gunning, starvation and working to death were going to take too long. More efficient means had to be sought. The ceaseless killing took priority even over the war effort, and by their continual and never-ending brutality, the Nazis greatly increased their resolve and indeed the numbers of their enemies. Nowhere was this more evident than in Soviet Russia. Stalin wanted a second front. The Americans wanted an early landing in France, but they were aware they needed at least a year to build up their army. Both Roosevelt and Churchill were becoming impatient for action. North Africa was their only alternative. On his way to Moscow to break this disagreeable news to Stalin, Churchill passed through Cairo. Disappointed with Auchinleck's performance, Churchill decided it was time for a change and replaced him with Montgomery. It proved to be one of Churchill's best appointments. Montgomery set himself methodically to beating Rommel, first of all assuring himself of complete superiority in men and tanks. Ultra proved to be key in his strategy. Knowing always when Rommel's supplies were due in Alexandria, he could see to it that they rarely arrived. The Second Battle of El Alamein began in late October. It proved to be too much for Rommel's Afrika Korps. They were steadily driven back first to Benghazi, then to Tunisia, this time for good. Though not the most spectacular of victories, El Alamein brought an emphatic stop to a long and miserable train of British reverses. Churchill was delighted. Their campaign was followed up almost immediately by the first combined Anglo-American venture, Operation Torch. The landings in Vichy, North Africa, were beset by political and strategical muddles, and the moment was lost. Nevertheless, the Nazi forces were caught on two sides. By the 11th of May, North Africa was safe in Allied hands. The tide was now turning at an alarming rate. The campaign, longer and larger than had been expected, resulted directly in further delays to the Second Front. Churchill's old chestnut to drive up the soft underbelly of Europe could finally be put into effect. Meanwhile, in the early months of '43, the U-boats had come near to winning the war's longest fought battle, sinking 43 ships during the first 20 days of March. Just in time, two new British devices came into play. The Huff-Duff radio location equipment, and yet more decisive, the airborne centimetric radar. The hunters now became hunted. In May, Dönitz had no option. He had to recall his U-boats. They would never again be a serious threat. As bombing was still the only way of striking directly at the enemy, Churchill continued to support Air Marshal Bomber Harris, who believed the war could be won with carpet bombing of major German cities. With American participation, the air offensive could intensify. In fact, the massive raids, while causing many civilian deaths and much wanton destruction, were of negligible military utility. Throughout 1943, German production soared. So did RAF losses. It was the Americans who eventually found the answer, building one of the outstanding planes of the war, the P-51 Mustang. Precision daylight bombings were now possible. It was first used in April 1944 against the synthetic oil plants with sound success. Over 500,000 men were committed to the invasion of Sicily, which began in July of '43. Unfortunately, the two commanders, the British Montgomery and the mercurial American Patton, did not see eye to eye, and a difficult relationship developed. Partly as a result, many of the German defenders got off safely to the mainland. The fall of Sicily had one important consequence. Mussolini had never enjoyed genuine popular support, and now the tattered sham that had been fascism collapsed virtually overnight. The Germans moved swiftly to assert control, and from being an unreliable ally, Italy became merely an occupied country. Not till September were the Allies able to land at Salerno. Subsequent progress was slow in the face of this resistance. The Germans had a series of well-prepared, good defensive lines. Dislodged with painful effort from one, they would fall back on another equally difficult to assault. By early 1944, the campaign was stagnating. It was another front that provided Churchill with good news. At Kursk, in the largest tank battle ever fought, the Germans suffered a crushing and devastating defeat. From then on, the Red Army had more and better guns and tanks, increasing air superiority and up to a 6-to-1 advantage in numbers. The Germans could now hope only to delay. Huge campaigns, unimaginable bloodshed still lay ahead, but Zhukov would reach Berlin. With such victories, Stalin's reputation rose sharply. So when the Big Three met at Tehran that December, appearances would suggest Churchill was now the junior player. The main agreement to emerge from Tehran was that the Normandy invasion, or overlord, would be pressed forward with all expedition. Italy would be secondary. Churchill could only acquiesce, but he was not finished with a soft underbelly yet. Roosevelt consented to allow landing craft otherwise destined for France to be kept on for a time in the Mediterranean. In Churchill's mind, it was still a major offensive, but yet again an inexcusable delay was followed by another near disaster. And so far from Anzio relieving the Gustav line, the line itself had to be carried by dogged frontal attack to relieve Anzio. Then General Clark's drive from Rome allowed the Germans once more to retreat in good order. For the rest of the year, the Allies battled northwards. The Italian campaign was the last occasion on which Churchill had a major hand in strategy. It was neither a triumph nor a disaster. German divisions were tied down, but there was no dazzling breakthrough. History would give an open verdict on the Allies' campaign in Italy. After the loss of her Far Eastern possessions, British efforts against the Japanese had been mainly directed to securing India and, under American pressure, to the reopening of the Burma Road. Here, General Slim and the 14th Army had huge successes. But the war against Japan was largely the domain of the Americans. Churchill and the country was exhausted. It needed one last enormous push through France to see absolute victory against Hitler. The preparations for the invasion of France, despite their immense scale, were meticulous. There was again much friction between the generals. Montgomery advocated a sharp pencil-thin drive into Germany, whereas the American Bradley favoured an advance on a more broader front. It would be again Churchill's skill at deception that would be the catalyst to the final push. Minesweepers, unnoticed, cleared a passage through the Channel waters, and early in the morning of 6th of June, the enormous operation finally got underway. Thousands of sorties were flown, and despite setbacks, by nightfall over 150,000 men had landed on the northern French beaches. A few days later, Churchill went across the Channel for a personal inspection. The German soldier was as sternly resilient in retreat as in conquest, and Hitler could still inspire fanatical loyalty. Nevertheless, within a week, a 60-mile beachhead had been consolidated. On the 27th of June, the Americans captured Cherbourg. Montgomery had hoped to take Caen in the first day. In fact, the town did not fall until after a month of hard fighting. By the end of July, the peninsula had been secured, and substantial German forces were now in danger of encirclement. The rousing to arms delivered by Churchill early on in the campaign was reminiscent of darker times. Let us go on then to battle on every front. Thrust forward every man who can be found. Drive on through the storm now that it reaches its fury, with the same singleness of purpose and inflexibility of resolve as we showed to the world when we were all alone. Hitler had one final trick up his sleeve. Soon after D-Day, Hitler let loose with the first of his so-called secret weapons. The V-1s were dealt with fairly easily. The V-2s, which followed in September, were more troublesome. The menace ceased only when the launching sites were overrun, but 9,000 Londoners were dead. On the 25th of August, de Gaulle re-entered his cherished Paris. Churchill and de Gaulle were never warm allies.
Two of Mr. Churchill's closest assistants were speaking to him one night in the study at Chequers, trying as tactfully as possible to persuade him to receive the General with reasonable courtesy and to forget the past. All right, he said. I'll be good, I'll be sweet, I'll kiss him on both cheeks, all four if you prefer it. He was always so funny.
Churchill still displayed prodigious energy. He went to Moscow with Eden. He failed to arrange an accommodation between Stalin and the Polish exiles, but he secured Stalin's promise not to intervene in Greece. In December, Hitler tried one final desperate gamble. For the last time, German divisions moved on the offensive, in the Ardennes, scene of an earlier triumph. For a short while, the Germans savoured former glories, but resistance quickly stiffened. The panzers ran out of fuel and in the clearing mists were exposed to murderous airstrikes. In a couple of weeks, the now infamous Battle of the Bulge was at an end. In the new year, another mighty Soviet push brought Zherkov's forward units within 50 miles of Berlin. That spring, Patton's tanks were scouring the east bank of the Rhine. Amidst the ruins of Germany's cities, the thousand-year Reich lay in its death robes. Roosevelt, the pragmatic, purposeful statesman, died on April the 12th. His nation would emerge from the war far richer and more powerful than ever before. The full compass of the Nazi evil was revealed for the first time to a horror-struck and disbelieving world. Churchill's unswerving crusade against the Nazi regime, first as a voice in the political wilderness, then as an indomitable war leader, found here abundant justification. The nature of the liberties for which he had fought was illustrated in remarkable fashion while Churchill was at Potsdam. The British people, exercising their democratic right, elected for the coming peace another leader. 5 years previously, Churchill had warned the British people that they were entering on a struggle for the survival of civilization itself and had promised victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be. Military and civilian casualties had been considerable. Britain's immense war debts would be a burden for generations. Her cities were devastated, her economy in ruins. Scientifically and industrially, she was firmly relegated to the second rank and entering a long decline. The cost had indeed been high, the terror great, the road both long and hard. But Churchill had led his people to a glorious victory.